Hello. Sorry if I talk rather quick. I've done this video a few times and I can never get to the 10-minute mark, so I'm going to try my best to do that. So I created a few of the packages and classes preemptively, but to go over them but first to create a Spring project, you want to go to File, New, Project, and you go to Spring Starter Project. This option is available to you once you have downloaded the Spring Tool Suite in Eclipse, which you get by simply going to Help and you go to Eclipse Marketplace. You could also go to the springstarter.io page, add your dependencies here, and it'll create your project for you. What you have to do is import it through Eclipse. To tell you which dependencies I've added, we added the web dependency, we added the Spring JPA data dependency, and we added the MySQL driver dependencies, as we're going to be using MySQL as our database. Alright, so now let's get started. I like to start with the most simplest thing, so let's start with the model package. In order to do that, you just go to your under your original package, go to New, Package, and you type in .model at the end. Inside of our model package, we have our, as you can imagine, models, or our POJOs, those are plain old Java objects. We will be working with a student model here because we're going to be managing students. Now, our student's going to have two parameters to keep it simple. Our student's going to have a student ID, which we'll name SID, create a long, and we're going to have a student name, which will be a string, obviously, and we'll call it sname. We are going to create our getters and setters. Generate getters and setters, select all. Get rid of some boilerplate. Beautiful. We're going to tell Spring, hey, we want this object to be converted to a database by typing in the entity annotation. And every database or entry into a database needs a unique identifier. So we're going to make our SID our unique identifier. And that's it for the model. We're going to move on to the DAO. Same thing with creating a package DAO. You just create a new package, .DAO at the end, and inside our DAO we're going to have our JPA repository. Our JPA repository is going to be an interface because it's not going to have any working methods. And in order for it to properly use a JPA repository, we're going to extend JPA repository. It needs the type of object it is working with, which is student objects. And it needs a type of the unique identifier, which is long, student ID. That's it for the student JPA. Lastly, we get the controller. The controller is going to be in charge of our API methods and functions. Yep. In order to make it a RESTful API, we're going to type in REST controller right here. Whenever Spring scans through it, it's like, oh, I need to be able to meet the standards of a REST API in order to properly use this function. Use this class. So we're going to need access to our JPA repo. So we're going to type in student JPA, and we're going to name the object repo. In order for it to work properly, we need to add all its dependencies, which will automatically happen if we just type in auto-wired. That way we don't have to create the object on our own. Spring will go to the trouble of handling that for us. Now let's create a GET request. So let's do public. We want to return a list of students. And let's name it get all students. Actually, let's name it get students. So get students, boom. And this is where our repo student JPA comes in handy. All we have to do is type in repo, and we get all of these options in order to access data in our database. So we want a list of students, so we do find all, and it returns all the students. Now for Spring to know that this is a GET request, we're going to use the GET mapping annotation. And we are going to name this URL get students. And that is all you need for a GET request. Nice and simple. We're going to test it in a second, but first let's create also a post request. So in order to do that, we create our function. We wanted to return student in order to check whether the student was entered properly or not. For that to happen, it needs to have the optional tag at the beginning, because it can either return the student or it can return an exception, and this allows us to handle both of those situations. We're going to name it add student, and we're going to return. Well, first we want to save the student there, so we can do repo.save. This allows us to save the data we want. It obviously takes in a parameter, so we are going to do that here, and we're going to name it new student. In order for the HTTP request to properly send it over, we need to use the @request body annotation. This puts the student in the HTTP request inside of its body, because in Postman, that's where we receive all of our data right here, so in the body. All right, so now we save that new student. Beautiful. And it needs a return statement. So return the new student. Oh, we need to find him first. So we do repo.find by ID. We find student by his unique identifier. And we do new student.get ID. And there we go. Last thing we need is the post mapping annotation. And we will name this one, and the same as a function, add student. All right, now let's double check we have everything perfectly set up. All right, we have our database set up here. This is the URL for our MySQL database. As you can see, I'm using port 8081, and I already created the database name student. We have the username here. It's usually a default root. I named it let me in, so I never forget. Show SQL query. That way it will show us the query of every single SQL HTTP request that we make. And we have update. Update, what allows us to do is that whenever we run our application, it will not delete all the data in our database. You can use create, and it will start the database new every time we launch our project, but that is more annoying than not, so we leave it like that. And the SQL dialect we're using is SQL 5. That's why we have that there. All right. So let's launch or relaunch depending on what you're using. Normally your first time it won't allow you to launch here. You would have to right click it, your project, and you do run as Spring Boot app. So our port is listening at 8080 and started student Spring application. Awesome. So now we already have some data in our database here. So if we create the get request for get students, we see that we already get some. The reason that this is null is because of a prior error in my database, but it works perfectly fine. So if we type in a new student right here, 107, and let's name her Mary. Let's send the request. We got the return response, which is what we expected as we returned it here. And if we do another get request for get students, we see Mary right there, we see Mark right there, and we see the other two students right there. Sorry that I did this so fast. I really wanted to make it to the 10-minute mark. The null students right there is simple. I redid this video a few times, and in one section I did name instead of S name, and so every time I added a student, the name wouldn't register properly. So after I fixed it, then it started working properly. That was the null errors right there. And as you can see here, we also have the SQL statements right here, as we've shown in our applications.properties file. All right, that's how you create a simple RESTful API. I hope you guys enjoyed my video. Hope you enjoyed my how I presented. I hope you consider me as a candidate, and I hope to hear from you soon, and that you have a great day. Thank you.